Welcome to the Beth Yeshua podcast. For more episodes like this, visit bethyeshua.org/media. Hi everybody, welcome back to the Beth Yeshua podcast. I'm Josh Rubenstein, and today I'm here with my mom, co-host. Hi Mom.
Hi, good to be here, kiddo.
And we also have a special guest today. We have Rabbi Schiffman with us, which is really wonderful. And we want to get into a lot of good conversations with him. But I just want to remind everybody as housekeeping before we get started, if you want to see us in addition to just hearing us, you can go over to the YouTubes and you can look at bethyeshua.sac, Sacramento. That's where we're at. And then also, if you're interested in more information about our community, you can go and check us out at bethyeshua.org. Okay, well, I'm going to introduce Rabbi Schiffman, and then we're going to kind of like have a round table. So I'm not going to be looking at you. I'm going to be looking like we're going to be looking at each other today. Rabbi Schiffman, I don't know how much experience any of you have, because I have no idea who you are with the Messianic movement. But Rabbi Schiffman has been part of the Messianic Jewish movement for a long time. And he was really, really wonderful friends with my dad. He's wonderful friends with us. And he comes out to our congregation as often as he can. We were really blessed this last time that he came out just on Friday. He repaired our Torah scroll, which really needed some work. It had been a long time since it had had repairs. He and my dad had birthdays that were very close to one another, so they do even buy each other steak dinners at the UMJC conference each summer.
But your dad was 10 years older. Make sure you
yes,
say that. Right?
Yeah. But like they were friends in the best ways. And it was also Rabbi Schiffman that really encouraged my dad to finish his smicha, which I know meant a lot to Dad. So in addition to that, Rabbi Schiffman leads Chevra, which is a humanitarian organization that does amazing things around not just like Europe, but like in Israel, around the world. And in addition to that, I know that he really mentors a lot of Messianic Jewish leaders, including people like my dad, like me. And he also teaches at King's University, and really is a mentor there, I think, for a lot of people too. So without any further ado, we're going to stop looking at you, and we're just going to look at each other, and we're going to have a conversation. So do you mind just telling everybody a bit about you? I know it's hard. There's probably a lot, but like broad strokes, how you maybe even grew up a little bit and then entered into Messianic Judaism.
Yeah, so long ago it's hard to remember. But I grew up in a traditional Jewish home, and something I enjoyed. I loved being Jewish, and when I was in college, I became a believer in Yeshua, and the reason was I saw Yeshua in the lives of my friends, and I was drawn to him.
Yeah,
and that's how I've lived my life for the past 50 years.
Yeah. Now I know that you had some theological training, like at some point, right? And how soon was that after you saw Yeshua and your friends and really put your faith in him?
I became a Yeshua follower in 1973. In 1977, I went to school. I worked on my I was in school in 73, but in 77, I started working on my master's and got a Master of Divinity. And then in 1988, I finished my doctoral work.
Okay. And what's your doctorate in?
Messianic Studies, actually.
Okay.
Great.
I always forget when you're doing the honorifics, which one's supposed to come first, the
Rabbi
doctor or the rabbi?
Rabbi doctor.
Rabbi
right?
doctor. You always do the spiritual one first.
Okay. All right. That's a good rule.
That's a good way to remember it.
Yeah, spiritual one first. I like that. Okay, so a doctorate in Messianic Studies. I'm wondering, what was your thesis? I'm assuming you had to like write a thesis and defend it?
I did a study of factors in Messianic congregations that encourage growth.
Whoa. Okay, and this was back in the 90s?
80s.
80s.
The 80s.
Okay,
Wow.
and what were your results?
Well, Usually the things that encourage growth were traditional liturgy, things that identified Jewishly, some of the music as well, but mostly the traditions of Jewish practice.
So like even like keeping Shabbat at home
Keeping
and
Shabbat,
life cycle
lighting
events.
Shabbat candles,
Right.
celebrating Jewish holidays.
Okay.
All those had a strong impact because they also differentiated Messianic congregations from churches.
Right. Right.
And so they were identity expressing and giving.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but it seems like those are still really big factors.
They're relevant, very relevant. Still.
Yeah.
Even
Yes.
today.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they are big factors, but you know the Messianic movement's changed over the years.
Yeah.
So there are other factors that have come into play since then.
Yeah. And I think we'll want to talk about that. Like we kind of have a structure for this time, or at least where we think it's going to go. But I think we definitely want to talk about that, especially towards the end, because
Yeah.
one of the things that we're wanting to explore in this podcast is where Messianic Judaism currently is, what we can do better, right, locally within our community, but then as a movement too, which is, I think, really cool for you. In some ways, I think you have the ability to shape the movement, right, in a way that many people don't. Do you mind telling people really quick about Chevra, maybe also in kind of broad strokes and the work you do with that?
Yeah. Chevra is my main work. It's a humanitarian organization, and we help Jews in crisis around the world. So we have been operating soup kitchens in Ukraine for the last 25 years, 30 years. We have also operating soup kitchens, bringing food parcels. We've helped Jews immigrate to Israel who wanted to get out of Ukraine. But mostly helping, the people we helped were mostly elderly because they were the lowest rung on the ladder. They were the people that were least receiving help, and they were the most needy. So we mostly were helping elderly Jews, no obligation for anything. If they were in need and they were Jewish, we would feed them and we would help them. When COVID hit around the world, we closed a lot of our soup kitchens because you weren't allowed to congregate in numbers. Right. So we switched to bringing food parcels, and everybody wore masks, and we delivered the food parcels. I didn't like that as much because food parcels cost more money than soup kitchens, and they didn't get as much.
Right.
So, but it was all we could do at the time. Then after COVID, we were able to open the soup kitchens again, and then the war broke out in Ukraine, and we were not only trying to operate the soup kitchens around where the people were being bombed, because we had something like 35 soup kitchens going in Ukraine, and they were every city where we operated was being bombed.
Wow.
So that was difficult. But we did other things. We helped a group of Jewish orphans escape Ukraine and get into Israel. We didn't put our name on it because we don't care about that kind of thing. We got to help, and that's a good thing. So we assisted some others who were doing the work by helping fund it. We also started bringing food to the border of Ukraine and Poland, because a lot of our workers are from Poland. So we would bring food to the border. We would feed the border guards because they needed food. There were people on lines for days before they could get from Ukraine into Poland, and we would be feeding them. Then we took vans and drove to the nearest cities, which were like Lvov or Lviv, depending on how you pronounce it. And we would bring food to the Jewish community centers there, and they would say, we have Jewish people who want to leave. And we put them in the van after they were empty from the food, and we drive them into Poland.
You didn't have any problems doing that?
No. But when we did, it's legal.
Oh, okay.
It was legal
Okay.
for them to come. But when we did that, we started working in conjunction with other humanitarian organizations and helped set up places where refugees could get food, medical assistance, transportation. They came to this small city called Przemyśl in Poland, which is where my family came from. So we were doing that. We cooperated with World Kitchens and a few other different organizations, because you can accomplish a lot more by working together with other people. So we were doing that, and we're still doing it. We got a lot of free humanitarian aid. All we had to do was pay for the transportation, and we got millions of dollars worth of humanitarian aid, and were able to get it distributed. So we helped a lot of people without it costing as much as it could have. So we were glad about that. And then the war started October 7th in Israel, and we started sending humanitarian aid there. So we were sending it to the Haifa area and also to the south. So, and that's what we've been involved with to this day, just helping Jewish people in crisis. We don't ask.
Yeah, aren't many of the ones you were originally working with, weren't they Holocaust survivors, or predominantly in the beginning?
But that was 30 years ago.
That was 30 years ago.
And
yeah.
There are still Holocaust survivors, but not nearly as many.
Right. Sadly.
And we're still helping Holocaust survivors, but I don't want to put that as our big thing, helping Holocaust survivors,
Right.
because it sounds like that's what we mainly do, and that would be misleading.
Good.
So while we help Holocaust survivors, and we'll always help Holocaust survivors as long as they're around, we're helping Jews in need, no matter what their background.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. You said the work in Ukraine is still going on, and are you guys still helping with Israel?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Those are just ongoing as long as there's need.
It's just as long as there's a need, we'll be helping them.
Okay.
And usually, given the state of the world, there's always a need somewhere.
Yeah.
And so it's like we'll never go out of business, because there's always people who have a need, and there's always a place where we can help. And I enjoy very much helping people in their time of need.
Yeah. Okay. By the way, a quick plug for those of you out there on the internet. Is it Chevra.org?
My Chevra.
My Chevra.
One word. mychevra.org.
Okay. mychevra.org if you would like to support that work. It's something that Beth Yeshua has been supporting for a long time. We really believe in it, so I would definitely recommend it. I want to pivot a little bit and talk about some of the, I don't know if they're controversial issues, but some of the issues that we've brought up on our podcast. Some of it was just timely, right? There was this conference, the summer conference, right? And there was a couple of things that were being brought up at the summer conference that we had strong feelings about. And I wanted to kind of get your take on them. And, one of them, also the sort of tangential one, I don't know if it's tangential, but it's just different, is there were some communities that were being installed as either member communities or associate committee communities that we had real concerns about. Just looking at their websites, we were like, what? It looked to us like a Hebraic roots church, sort of, and we were wondering what on earth is going on with the membership process within the UMJC. Were you there at the summer conference?
I was I was sitting next to your mother.
We were sitting next to each other.
You guys were, okay, very cool.
Elbowing each other.
All right. So I'm wondering, did you, we'll handle the small one first. Did you see any of those kind of, I don't know if I would call them controversial, but maybe non-typical UMJC applications for membership or associate status, and wonder about them also? Or was it just us who were like, what is going on here?
No, I wonder about such things. You have to realize I have a perspective of a long period of time. When the Messianic movement in this country started in the early 70s, we defined things differently. The term Messianic was only used of Messianic Jews who worshipped in Messianic congregations. If you were a Jew in a church, you were not a Messianic Jew. It was only
Correct.
Messianic Jews who were in Messianic congregations. And then the term became more popular. And several groups like Jews for Jesus and others started using the term. And it soon it morphed from being Jewish believers in Messianic congregations to being Jewish believers no matter where they were, whether they were in church or anywhere else. And then it morphed again in the 90s and became a place. Messianic congregations were described as a place where Jew and Gentile could worship together. And because you were getting more Gentiles coming in.
Right.
Because in the early days there weren't. They were pretty much just Jewish believers, maybe an intermarried spouse or something like that, but that was it.
As a rabbit trail, really quick.
Yeah.
Why? Why do you think we had that influx? We're going to deal with this in a future podcast because it's really fascinating to me.
Yeah.
I think it coincided with the internet and people
well,
becoming aware.
Let me finish
Yeah.
the progression, and then I'll come
Yeah,
back
finish
to
the
that.
progression. I'd love to hear that.
Okay, and then lately it's not even Jew and Gentile walking together. Now it's one new man, neither Jew nor Gentile. The problem I have with that is the one new man is never a Jewish one.
Mm.
It's always a non-Jew.
That's true.
And so it's like the de-Judification of the Messianic movement.
Right.
And that concerns me greatly.
I think
Because
some of
if
that-
this is supposed to be a Jewish movement, you can't have a Jewish movement without Jewish people.
Right. And you've been in a lot of the world. You've seen a lot of the United States Messianic Jewish congregations also. You've had conversations with the leaders. Our general perception is that most of Messianic Jewish congregations, certainly in the United States, are predominantly Gentile.
Yeah, and that's, to me, a problem.
Right.
No
That's
offense,
also-
no offense to people who aren't Jewish.
Right.
People can't help how they're born.
Right.
But here's the thing. A lot of people joined us because they were either disenchanted with their churches
Mm.
or they were looking for the truest expression of faith.
Right.
And so they felt that has to be the Jewish roots because that's the roots of the entire faith is Jewish, and it had been put aside for so many centuries.
Right.
So people started gravitating in this direction, and it was the urge to be the most correct.
Mm.
But that is not what Messianic congregations are for. They're not so you can say you have the most pure version of faith.
Right.
It's
Or even
designed.
closer to first century or whatever.
Yeah,
Right.
it's designed to be what it originally was, a place for Jewish people to follow Yeshua while living Jewish lives and raising Jewish children to be Jewish while following Yeshua.
Mhm.
And that is a far cry from Jew and Gentile worshiping together,
Right.
and it's a even further cry from one new man.
Mhm.
And so my vision has always been the original one.
Right.
And that's really where I am today. I have a lot of friends who aren't Jewish. You can be friends with people, it's not a problem. You can be close friends with people, and it's not a problem. But redefining things and changing the boundaries has been detrimental.
Right.
And that is an area of great concern to me.
Us too.
As to-
In our community, we saw so much confusion, identity confusion, people appropriating Jewish identity. We saw children confused, families confused.
There are a lot
Families
of
who
problems.
left because we did not confirm or affirm that by virtue of being there that they became Jewish.
There are a lot of problems with it. One of the problems is if you have a non-Jewish family that comes to your congregation and that's where they're bringing their family, their children,
Right.
their children will, the Jewish heritage is not theirs. So they'll have no heritage. They're robbing them of who their heritage is.
Mm.
And that's not a good thing for the children. But also it has another backfire to it that to me is very concerning, and that is that Jewish kids in Messianic congregations are taught that it's special. Our heritage is special. Being Jewish is special. But then when they see non-Jews doing all this Jewish stuff, it's like anybody can do it. It's not so special anymore. And they turn away from it. And to me, that's insidious. You do not separate Jewish kids from their heritage.
Wow.
And that's too high a price.
Right.
And mislead children who aren't Jewish into, away from their heritage,
Yeah.
essentially,
It's,
right?
it's not a good idea all the way around.
No,
And for this desire, for people who want to have the most correct form of worship, look, it's not a question of Saturday or Sunday. Jewish people worship 7 days a week. You know, follow a Siddur. There's the daily Siddur because you pray daily, and then Shabbat. Shabbat is not so much the day to worship, it's a special day to worship because Shabbat is a covenant sign between God and the Jewish people.
Right.
But we worship 7 days a week.
Right.
This whole thing about which is the correct day isn't a Jewish question.
Right.
yeah,
Right.
I love that.
Yeah,
Well
and
said.
frequently we hear that. So then broadly looking at membership within the UMJC, you would see that people that are coming in with some of these, I mean, they're even like named, the names of their congregations. Sometimes we'll even say Hebrew Roots Congregation or Church or whatever else, right? For you, that's not Messianic Judaism.
No.
Right.
So
However-
therefore, why are they there? Does that trouble you at all?
It's not my position to know why they're there.
Okay.
So
But why are we
it's not that I
paving the way,
it's not that I
essentially?
don't wonder about it,
Right.
but it's not my position. And to be brutally honest, I am charged with a work that raises money so we can feed hungry Jews.
Right.
And I want to feed them, and I want people to be involved in helping, whether they're Jewish or Hebrew roots or whatever they are. If they will help us to feed Jews in need, that's what I'm about.
Right.
So I'm not here judging any of them, but I'm also not going to say, oh yeah, you're Jewish, so they'll give a few dollars. I will not do that.
Sure.
But my goal is to say, great, you're here, help us.
Right.
If they're not going to help us, whatever.
Why are they here?
But that's not my job.
Actually, you're saying that within the union, why are they there? And we're saying it within the congregation. If they're not there specifically to help and encourage the vision
Right.
that for the Messianic synagogue, then why are they there?
And that is the biggest issue. You just hit the nail on the head. The fact that if somebody is in a Messianic congregation and they are Jewish, they should be there because it's for them.
Right.
It's all for them.
It was created for them.
But
Right.
but if they're not Jewish, they should at least be helping and supporting the Jewish people there. And just showing up is not support. If they're going to help, let them serve. Let them donate. Let them do things that will help build the Messianic community. But sitting there and just soaking it all in is no help to the Messianic community at all.
Yeah.
And that may offend some people, and I'm sorry, I'm not looking to offend anyone, but that's the truth.
But I recently had, I think I shared this with you guys the other night, I recently had an encounter with a woman who came and really loved what she saw going on, and should I be here? Should I come? She asked the question, and so we were able to have a very honest conversation saying how important it was that this place was created to help encourage Jews in that faith and continue to raise their children that way, and it was not just distracting, it was detrimental if it was filled up with people who just love the Jewish people so they're hanging out. But there are ways to help. And this person realized that, and she, I've started a wonderful conversation, and I think she realized that maybe that's what God has called her to do, that she's helping in other ways without necessarily attending.
Yeah,
So
I think that's great.
I was very encouraged.
The thing is,
Yeah.
I call it the Dungeons and Dragons syndrome.
Oh, no.
I was never into Dungeons and Dragons, but people create these fantasy personalities, characters,
Right.
Yeah.
and they
Skins or whatever.
and they assume it,
Right.
and then they're playing. I had a lady once tell me she was a Levite princess.
Oh,
I laughed for 10 minutes because there's no such animal,
Right. Yeah.
but she made it up.
Right.
This is not fantasy.
Right.
If you're a Levite, you're a Levite, but you're a real Levite.
Right.
This is not a game. You don't assume a character. If you're a Jew, you're a Jew. And if you're not, don't pretend to be what you aren't.
Right.
This is not about games, because if you take faith really seriously, you live it seriously.
Yeah.
And making believe you're somebody you're not is not the way to do it. It takes away credibility, and it makes it a game.
Right.
And Jewish people to this day, especially now in these days, anti-Semitism has gone up so much, and Jewish people have been under attack. College students on campuses
Right.
have been under attack. This is no game,
Right.
and it's not something that people take lightly.
Right.
And it's kind of offensive to me because these people want to play Jewish, but they won't do anything to help Jews.
Yeah.
And I find that highly offensive.
Yeah. We've definitely experienced that in our community. I do want to point out a couple of things of nuance, though, because I think we have a lot of people watching that are in a bunch of different places. Probably some non-Jewish people in our community would watch this podcast and they'd say, like, well, then I'm not welcome and I should go. No. So, like, there are people who are doing that servant-hearted, like, let's build this thing, and it's not about me, and I'm not trying to assume an identity, and like what I often think of it as is kind of that Ruth heart of, like, your people will be my people, your God will be my God, but not in like I'm assuming Jewish identity, but like I'm here for you. And then I think also sometimes we've had people be like, oh, well, what does that mean for my intermarried family? Does that mean we're not welcome? Like the Gentile spouse is not welcome within this community? No, that's not, for us, that's not reality at all, because for us, and we could get into this with identity, we recognize patrilineal as well as matrilineal descent, and so those kids are Jewish, and the kids that would come out of those marriages are Jewish, and we want them to know that and be solid in that. So really, Beth Yeshua was built for them.
Yeah.
But sometimes they hear like, well, this is not a Gentile movement, and so the Gentile part of that marriage is like, oh, well, then it's not really for me.
I think that's where you have to talk to people more and communicate directly to them and say, no, this is for you, and you're more than welcome. We consider you part of the family.
Right.
And so you're here. I like to liken it to being in a living room. For me to be comfortable, I have to feel like it's my living room. If I go to a service that I feel like a foreigner, I'm in someone else's living room, and I'll never feel real at home.
Right.
That's a very good point.
But if
actually, yeah.
and so I may have people come visit me who are not Jewish. They can sit in my living room. They can visit me there, but it's my living room. If I have people who are Jewish, I'm sharing the living room with them. It's their living room too, because we're one big family. In this scenario. Similarly, if they're married to someone who's not Jewish, you know what? They're part of the family too.
Right.
They have a right to be in my living room.
Right.
But when I have people who just want to say, "Oh, I had a transfusion and I found out the guy was Jewish, so I have Jewish blood," give me a break. That is not that.
Right.
That's not being Jewish.
And you would think that would be hyperbole. We have heard some of the most wild
Oh, my goodness.
reasons for people thinking that they're Jewish.
Absolutely,
You
and
would
it's
be shocked.
it's.
I don't think he would be shocked.
No, you would not be shocked. Y'all might be shocked.
Y'all.
It makes Jewish identity trivial,
Right.
and that's wrong,
Right.
because people are suffering in the world today for their identity as Jews.
Yeah.
Jewish people in Israel are dying on the front because they're Jews, and they're being attacked by the Arabs around them because they're Jews.
Right.
Maybe you're not supposed to say Arabs, but who are they? They're Arabs. And for all due respect to whoever, Jewish people, Israelis, are being attacked
Right.
just because they're Jews. And they have to defend themselves.
Right.
And they have to defend the state of Israel. And I think it makes it cheap to simply put on your little Jewish costume and act like you're Jewish, and then you go back to being whatever you are when you go home. And as soon as anti-Semitism comes, oh, no, I'm Italian, I'm German, I'm whatever. I'm Irish,
Right.
But only when they're playing games in our congregations do they act like Jews. That is the Dungeons and Dragons syndrome.
Right. Right. And those are the people that we've often talked about within our community that seem to only take and they are not giving, not just financially, but in tangible acts of service sometimes, and just coming to, you know, tear down tables and set up chairs and other things like that, you know, just those very practical ways.
If people want to help, they can be kind and they can be generous with their time and their energy.
Right.
Because if you're going to say you're standing with us, first I expect you to speak up. If you hear anti-Semitism, speak up on our behalf.
Right.
Because that's very rare. Most people are keeping their mouths shut, and that's very disheartening. But secondly, if you see we need help with something and you can do it, then help us.
Right.
You know, if I saw somebody who was struggling and they needed help, I'd help them. Why not do it for us? If you really think you should be here, then help us. Have a reason for being here.
Right, right. So, man, that was a lot from just the beginning of the UMJC conversation. The next one on the docket would be women as rabbis. And I don't know, I think you probably talked with Bubby a little bit about
We
like
sat
where-
side by side with all the voting
Yeah.
going on, and
Yeah.
we could nudge each other, but he has a very interesting perspective.
Yeah, so break it down for us.
Okay, several things.
Okay.
It's a complicated issue.
It is.
Very much so.
First of all, if I look at the Jewish world, other than the Orthodox, who are not the largest group, I mean, they're
10%,
good size.
I think it's.
Yeah, but I
10%,
mean,
so.
the rest of the Jewish world is larger.
Yeah.
In most of the Jewish world, having women ordained as rabbis is normative. And
Since when? How long would you say, going back?
the last 20 to 30
I was going
years.
to say 20 to 30, right?
So, well,
Yeah.
if you think about it, bat mitzvahs are only like
Right.
less than 100 years old.
Okay.
Right.
So, I mean, you have to start somewhere.
Right.
The argument is called the egalitarian argument, that women are as spiritual as men. There's no hierarchy with that. But the majority of the Jewish world acknowledges women rabbis. That's step one. Secondly, you have in the Messianic movement a problem. We have leaders who are not Jewish, who get ordained through us, and they call themselves rabbis. And it's kind of laughable to have a rabbi who's not Jewish.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, it just, by
What if they had
definition,
been- What if they had been converted, they were converted? Would that be different?
it would.
Think of
If
it
they've gone
differently.
through formal conversion,
And then became a rabbi?
it would be different. But you have a lot who haven't.
Right.
They just accepted Yeshua and suddenly they declare themselves Jewish, and they grow a beard and have a leather-bound Bible, and suddenly they're Rabbi O'Malley. It just doesn't fit, and it takes away from the credibility of the movement
Yeah.
to have non-Jewish rabbis. It even says in the Torah, you shall not appoint a foreigner as a leader of your people. I mean, it's in the Torah. I didn't write it.
Yeah.
And so we will allow Gentile rabbis because they're men, but they have no other connection. On the other hand, you have Jewish women who sometimes are the only ones there to hold up that congregation and serve. And they're doing the work of a rabbi. And I feel, why, if they're doing the work and they have the education and they go through all of that, why forbid them to be ordained? The thing is, it does not require, if your congregation does not want a woman rabbi, you don't have to have her. But why stop some other congregation that might want to have her from having a woman who happens to be ordained? It's like, if I don't like something, I don't have the right to tell you you can't do it. That's the reason I'm more in favor of it.
Sure.
Well, back to the union's role in that, then, they're not really ordaining per se, are they? I mean, what, if they
Okay,
receive smicha, what's
the way
what's
the union
distinction?
is set up, we do ordinations. That's what we do, because that early in our organizations, the union was supposed to be an umbrella organization
Right.
for all the congregations, because we had very different kinds of congregations, as we still do. So we were ordaining people because we didn't have an ordaining body. In the Jewish world, people are not ordained that way. They are ordained through their school, their, like Jewish Theological Seminary or Yeshiva University. That's where they get their ordination.
Right.
But we're not set up that way. So probably we should move in that direction. Within the union, there's another organization called the Messianic Jewish Rabbinical Council. Now, they also ordain, but it's a rabbinical council, not a congregational organization.
Right.
And they do ordain women as well. However, it's still, every congregation is free to have whoever they want as their rabbi, whether it's man or woman. People call themselves rabbi whether they're ordained or not these days, just because they're leading a congregation. And so, since we're ordaining people who, some of them are not Jewish, I think it's a further stretch than ordaining a woman, especially if she's from a Jewish background.
Okay.
So it's more like on that technicality.
Yeah, okay. So for us, when we were looking at it, we recognize obviously all the cultural things that you're pointing to. Those are definite realities, right? The culture of women as rabbis within mainstream Judaism, and for decades. We recognized the reality. I don't know if we really talked, though, about the one about Gentile males being allowed to be rabbis, or being kind of assuming that. We didn't really talk about that and how discordant that is with the idea of then a Jewish woman being able to step up into that leadership position. Our biggest concern was really those passages that Paul was writing about, where he was talking about kind of like order, like spiritual order. And it seems like those positions of eldership need to be men. And to us, the theological basis kind of outweighed the others.
To me, that's a question of interpretation of Paul.
All right.
First of all, most of Paul's letters are like midrash.
Sure.
They're not, law. They're not halakha. They're more midrash.
Commentary, essentially.
Yeah. And of course, I accept Paul's writings as authoritative. I'm not brushing it aside. However, it's how we understand them that is the question. In some places, Paul said, a woman should be quiet. She shouldn't do this. But what was the culture in that city? These were not Jewish cities. And the people were not Jewish in these congregations, most of them. There were some, but not most of them. And, you have a question about should a woman have her head covered or a man not have his head covered? Right. Well, you can argue, why wear a kippah if it says a man should not have his head covered? Right. Except if you go into the Greek, what Paul was talking about was veils. Kind of like what Arab women wear, covering their face and their head. And Paul said a woman should have her head. It's proper that a woman should be covered and a man shouldn't. So he was using hyperbole there. Right. So, but we could say, well, Paul said a man should not have his head covered. How can you wear a kippah? It would be a misunderstanding, and it would not be fair to the text to just take it like that without the interpretation of understanding. The same is true with the question of women and their positions. At what point does it say a woman should not be serving in that way? We have in Scripture even things Paul wrote about. There were women who were apostles. They're listed among the apostles. You have Priscilla and Aquila, who were both in leadership and serving. Priscilla was a woman. There were a lot of women in service and not sitting there meekly in the corner. Sure. They were active in ministry. Phoebe, there were others.
Yeah. But as far as eldership, which is what we really see, it's like the rabbi is like the head elder of a community.
And it's more of a spiritual authority.
Yeah. We obviously within our community, we have women serving and helping. Like our community would fall apart without the women that are part of our community. But like that role of eldership seems to be referred to only with the male, like over and over and over again.
Well, even when it designates and saying, and then you know, they would have one
That's
wife,
usually,
et cetera,
that's
et cetera,
usually,
right?
it says the husband of but one wife.
Right.
But that may have just been at the time also, because that's how it was. It could have just as easily be the spouse of one spouse, of one
You
partner.
mean at one at a time, even
Yeah.
potentially, instead of multiple?
Because there's question with that. Can you be an elder if you're divorced? Because you're supposed to have only one wife. I mean,
Right.
there are different ways you can peel the onion.
Sure.
And so I recognize that. And look, just because someone is a man, and I recognize what you're saying, and I do appreciate it,
Yeah.
but just because someone is a man does not mean he's qualified to serve as an elder.
Sure.
And just because someone is a woman does not mean she's not qualified. I would rather have a woman as an elder who is qualified spiritually, who has insight and depth and I can rely on to give good spiritual, godly advice, than some guy whose only claim to being an elder is his genitalia. That is not sufficient. So,
But if they were equal, all things considered,
okay,
or like, well, for me, like, and I think that there's a problem with passivity, spiritual passivity with males in particular. And I think that we see that kind of growing across the United States where, like, really within all of organized religion, the women have stepped up into major authority roles, and it seems to me like men are not taking responsibility. I liken it to Adam and Eve is being tempted, and Adam's standing there, and he doesn't say anything. Like, he needed to get involved. He should have said, like, whoa, hey.
But it also could have been that men are being that way anyway, not because of the women being in positions.
Right, I'm not saying that,
Yeah.
but I'm saying that I think that there has been
An
a
erosion?
stepping
Yes.
away from like a spiritual responsibility by men. And I mean, it's part of the brokenness of the world. And I'm
Yeah.
not saying that like not allowing women to be rabbis solves it. Like, I just think that there's a real need for men to step up spiritually and actually stand in those positions to be a worthy
Well,
man.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
But if they're not going to, somebody has to stand up there.
Mm.
But do you think if somebody doesn't, if a woman did not step up, do you think men would then be encouraged that maybe they need to be drawn back in and step up? I mean, because then if somebody fills the spot, it's like we need a Shabbat school teacher. We don't want someone to come and say, "Oh, I'll do it," because nobody's there. We want somebody who's called to do it.
Right.
So is this person called?
They could be. It depends, man or woman. I don't know what God's going to do. That's His calling. It's not mine. Here's the thing. I had, many years ago, decades ago, I spoke in a congregation. It was a church. I was sharing about the Passover Seder. They invited me to come. And it was the first time, it was a pastor of a church, and he introduced me to his assistant pastor, who was a woman. It was the first time I saw a woman in that role. And I froze up, and he noticed. And he said, "You know something? A lot of people would object to her being in a pastoral role. But," he said, "let me tell you something. She can speak to some women who would never speak to me. And she has a valid ministry, and I would never second guess it." And it made me realize ordination of women doesn't have to be for a senior rabbi position. If she's serving, she can still be ordained. The polity of the local congregation will determine on what level she serves. So you can ordain a woman, and it doesn't mean she's going to be the senior rabbi. She might be the rabbi of women or something like that, or she might have different responsibilities.
Right.
So to me, if she's going to be serving, why not let her get the education, get the training, and be the best servant she can be? Isn't that why we get education in the first place?
Sure. I just, for me, I guess the term rabbi implies like that
That's
that
only in our
spiritual
movement.
headship.
That's only in our movement.
Right,
Because
it's not
in
within
the larger
traditional,
Jewish
yeah.
world, you have a lot of rabbis who are not congregational leaders.
Hmm.
And they're still rabbis. I'm a rabbi and I'm not a congregational leader.
Right.
But,
Yeah.
but
Yeah,
I have
okay.
been, but I'm not currently, and I haven't for many years.
Yeah.
So the thing is, it's not, in the Jewish world, it is not simply that position.
Right. Eldership is not necessarily equal with rabbi, which is not necessarily equal with the spiritual head of the community.
Yeah.
Especially structurally within a lot of synagogues, you have a board, obviously, that's many times making decisions, sometimes irregardless of the desires of the rabbi.
Yeah.
Right, the president makes the
In a lot
decisions,
of
right?
congregations, the rabbi is a religious functionary.
Right.
He's there for weddings, funerals, bar mitzvahs, etc., available for counseling and for making halakhic decisions for the community.
Mhm.
This is how we're going to celebrate. But they don't have the power to throw somebody out of the synagogue because they're not in charge.
Mhm.
They can't say this is the way we're going to go because that's the board's decision.
The board has vision.
Yeah, because the rabbi is hired and they don't have to renew his contract after it's up.
Mhm.
So, it's just a factor.
Would you say that then the way that we function within Messianic Judaism is kind of residual from so many of our initial leaders having come out of the church?
Yeah,
Okay.
it's
Yeah, the whole structure.
it's a
is
little more
different.
autocratic.
Right.
And
right.
that's not consistent with the Jewish world.
Right.
Maybe with some of the Hasidim, when you have a Rebbe.
Right. Sure.
But these guys, our guys aren't Rebbes.
Right.
So it's a little bit of a stretch there.
Okay. Interesting.
That does put an interesting perspective to it.
It puts a definite twist on
Yes,
it that I hadn't
yeah.
considered, definitely. And it's interesting too because when I think about, if I had been in the room and I was predicting who would vote for and against, I could see that the people that are more closely tied to traditional Judaism would have voted for,
women as rabbis.
and
Yeah.
those who are more tied to, like, well, I wouldn't even call it like church culture. It's not necessarily that their congregation is a reflection of the church culture, but I could see them being the ones that would be opposed to it because there's that perception of senior pastor equals rabbi. Yeah. Well, and even then, like if you have a large church, the senior pastor is probably hired by their board. Yeah. I don't know.
And there's
Interesting.
another factor.
But I think, well, I was going to say
The-
too, that the women who had been studying, even when I was studying, there were women who were studying that were not afforded smikah. Basically, they could do all of the work and learn it all. And women are spiritual beings. We want to learn these things. So they would learn everything. At the time your father received smikah, there was one woman who did not receive smikah, but she completed everything. She kind of got a certificate of completion.
Which
And
is
I-
a far cry from
From-
smicha.
Absolutely,
And-
right.
But here's
right.
another factor.
And that was.
I
all,
mentioned
you know,
that the MJRC, the Messianic
Right.
Jewish Rabbinical Council, has been ordaining women for the last 10 years. In 10 years, do you know how many women we've ordained? One.
That was the other thing. that was
And
brought
she
up,
was
yeah.
well
It's not gonna
qualified,
be a-
and she's not
yeah.
leading a congregation.
Mm.
But in 10 years, one. There are no floodgates being opened. This past conference, when the UMJC started ordaining women, we ordained one woman. Why? Because she was ready, and it was a just in case if it passed.
And she has been the head of her congregation for how many years, would you say?
Probably from the beginning.
Which, like 15, I mean,
Yeah,
a long time.
they opened it.
Well, and she and her husband both are in ministry, but he
She's-
doesn't really lead the congregation.
He
She
does other ministry
Yeah.
also. That's her main
That's
thing.
her main-
Are they both Jewish?
Yes.
And they're, yeah.
If she wasn't, we wouldn't have ordained her.
No, obviously, but like
Yeah.
The
I was
husband,
wondering
too, is
about the
Jewish,
husband.
yeah.
They're
yeah.
both Jewish.
Okay. Does he have ordination?
Yes.
He does.
In
Okay.
fact, they were the first couple to be ordained
They
together.
were ordained at the same time.
Got it. Okay.
But the thing is, I have a couple of women who approach me and say they want to be ordained. I said, so study. it's not my place to say yes or no for them. If they do the work and they match it, they could be ordained, at least by the union at this point. But it doesn't mean we're saying they can serve as a senior rabbi. That isn't, it's like some things that were legal in this country were turned over to the states,
Right.
and then it became a state decision.
Right.
And that's a
Well,
sort
the same
of
is true.
congregation
The
decision.
same is
Yeah.
true in the union. We can ordain people, but whether they get hired or are allowed to be serving as a senior rabbi, that's up to the congregation.
Sure.
If
And remember the wording even when they put it up at the delegates meeting, it said, this is not assuming that they would necessarily become a senior leader in their congregation.
Yeah.
There was some wording to that effect, so it was even in there, rather than just leave a blanket thing that now they're rabbis and whatever happens.
So the actual wording of the
wording
policy that was
says-
voted on.
was said that this is
Includes
not
them.
necessarily that they wouldn't, but it also, that they could be.
Right.
They could be,
Yeah.
but it's up to the
But it
congregation.
shows you that part of the problem is our definitions.
Right.
They probably need to be sharpened up
Right.
to specify what this means.
Yeah.
But
Well, and also maybe our governmental structure within communities.
Yeah.
I just think like it might be almost different. Like every single Messianic leader that I speak to, I feel like their governmental structure is slightly different than ours. I don't think like any of them actually align really with one another.
Well, it's interesting you say that. 34 years ago, when Beth Yeshua began, I took the bylaws from many different congregations, including Stuart Dowerman's congregation, many different congregations, Russ's congregation in Albuquerque, studied them and pulled it together and made the bylaws for Beth Yeshua. They're operating basically the way we are. They have a board of elders. They have the rabbi in charge and not a president.
Yeah.
No membership dues, and really still that's back to be more church-like and essentially
Yeah.
how it's funded, how it's organized. So I thought,
Interesting.
yeah,
So it varies. It would probably be good if at some point we tightened all that up, the language, and define out what things are.
Right.
The problem is we have ideas in our heads, but we don't have boundaries set,
Right.
and that could solve a lot of problems.
but it could be. But as we know from the delegates meetings, many times it's a huge discussion of how do we do that. And
Yeah.
here was my other point too, was at this particular meeting this last summer, the only people who were allowed to vote on whether or not women should become rabbis, be ordained as rabbis, was for those who happened to be in attendance. And if you have, it may have come out the same way. I mean, you think it would have come out the same
Yeah.
way. But if all the congregations got a chance to vote on something that monumental, whether they were in attendance or not, they got to have an absentee vote. I would at least like to have known that.
Let me put
I
it.
would like to have known how it would have gone.
Let me throw a different wrench into the
Okay,
argument.
wrenches, go.
Technically, delegates who are not ordained should
That's
have
true.
no say on who's going to be a rabbi.
Well,
That should only be the space of ordained rabbis to say who's going to be a rabbi.
actually, I do agree with that idea.
So, I mean, some schmo who he was the only one who was going to the conference, and he gets there. Why should he have a say on he's not qualified.
I was there as a delegate. I'm not,
You're not
I'm
a schmo.
leader.
You're
right.
not a schmo either.
No, but I'm not the leader.
But I'm just saying, and I'm not disparaging anybody who's a delegate. But
No,
what I am
no.
saying is that just being a delegate does not qualify you to say who's a rabbi.
Right.
And
I
so,
agree with
so having a vote like that is also questionable.
Should we have done it, do you think?
Well, as I said, ultimately, either a rabbinical assembly, not a congregational organization, but a rabbinical assembly, part of the union, that would be like the College of Rabbis, like College of Cardinals. They get to decide. The average Catholic doesn't pick the Pope. Only the cardinals do. And we're not talking Pope here. Because if it was, I want the job. But I don't have enough following. really, other rabbis should say, yeah, I think this person would be a good rabbi, or no, I don't think this person would be a good rabbi. Instead, what we have is, can you believe they ordained him? By what basis? Why? Because the delegates said we could.
Right.
That's interesting.
It's a spiritual.
Yeah.
If it's a spiritual position, it should be the people who should be having that say should just be the Board of Rabbis or the theological school that graduated them.
Mm-hmm.
And if either one would be acceptable and more consistent within the Jewish world.
And then still, they may or may not be accepted within a congregation to be their senior leader.
Right.
But still, it's not on the union, and as you're saying, not really. Many of those who are delegates have never received smicha. I mean,
Right.
myself included.
Yeah.
Right.
But I have two things that I wonder about, though. It is a decision that has the potential to affect the entire
Yes.
organization, right? And so, not that your council wouldn't necessarily make the best decision in that case, but to me, it feels like we have the technology to allow each senior leader of each congregation to be able to vote, no matter whether or not they were able to afford a plane ticket. And so to me, that's like one, and like denying them the ability to vote when that is currently how our bylaws actually work. I mean, it wasn't a denying. They had a choice of whether or not they could come. But like, I feel like we could extend, especially for things that are kind of
This is
a
a
big
big
deal.
issue.
But
it
for
has-
me, I'd say they shouldn't even be
I get that.
deciding. In
Right.
fact, when we do the actual ordaining, we call up the people who are going to be ordained, and then we call up the committee that presides over ordination,
Right.
and then we call up, and all of them have to be ordained, by the way, and then we call up every ordained Messianic rabbi in the room
Right.
who's part of it. They all come up, and they're the ones that lay hands on it.
But they're not
And-
making the decision of
No,
that they're standing up
but I'm
there.
saying
Yeah.
they're the ones who
Yeah.
should decide on the policy for it,
Mm.
because they're the ordained ones.
Well, but what about this? I think if a person, such as Josh, is in the position of being the leader of a community, and he has not completed his coursework, but yet he has been effectively leading his community for 14 years, I would want him, not me or some other leader of the congregation who happened to just show up at that delegates meeting, I would want him, whether he could come or not, to have that, to at least the way we exist right now, I'd like for him to be the one to make that decision.
Well-
I can't just like call him up and say, okay, gosh, they're about to say this now, what do you think?
But we
You know?
had,
But-
we had
but-
also
We did
had the
talk ahead of
conversation.
time, we
Yeah,
did.
but what
now
I'm
our
saying
delegates
is-
are doing that with, you know,
What I'm saying is he should be allowed to have a say on what happens in your congregation. But if somebody else's congregation wants to have an
which would be
ordained
whether or
woman
not you're
rabbi,
ordained.
yeah, then I shouldn't have a say on what some other congregation does.
Mm.
You know, that's their individual thing, that's the point. But on the question of ordination itself, which does not necessarily, at least in my view, does not necessarily imply fitness or function as a congregational leader,
Right, right.
but simply a level of education and preparedness
And
of
calling,
and
hopefully,
calling
right.
of service. That should be by a board of rabbis, not by delegates who were elected or appointed
Even appointed,
to
right.
to be, you know, because it's a mixed bag,
Mm.
and that's a problem
Yeah. I
because
get
it's
that.
But then if that were the case, it wouldn't be the union doing the ordaining, and it shouldn't be so
Which was my
controversial
point.
within the union.
which is my point all along.
Yeah.
The union shouldn't be doing the ordaining.
Mm.
We should have a board of rabbis within the union who would decide on union ordination. I would take it away from the delegates and put it only for ordained rabbis within the union,
Mm.
because they're the ones who are the ordained people.
It's kind of like
Already-
elders deciding if another
Yeah.
elder, when another elder comes in.
Right.
It's kind of part of our bylaws.
Versus the entire congregation
They can
voting.
affirm, but they
Yeah,
don't
they
call
affirm,
them in. Yeah.
which, maybe, I don't know. But the union as it exists right now does recognize people as like senior leaders of communities, whether or not they're rabbis, right?
Right.
And I don't, is there like a certificate or anything for that, or is it just like we recognize that
We
you're
have a
the spiritual
certificate
leader?
of recognition,
Right,
but that does not afford you a title.
right,
No.
correct.
But your local congregation will give you whatever title you're going to have. They'll
Right.
call you whatever they're going to call you.
Right,
But if someone wants the formal title
right,
of rabbi, they need to go through ordination.
right, right,
But again, formal title of rabbi does not mean congregational leader.
right.
It's
Which
much
is-
more nuanced than I even
Yeah,
understood.
then our
Yeah.
conversation,
Yeah.
yeah, for sure. Okay. I mean, not that
Well, a
we're
lot of
putting
food for
a
thought.
neat
Lot of
little,
food for thought,
bow on
yeah.
that, but I did want to hear, before we wrap up, I kind of want to hear your thoughts, because this is one of the things that we're wanting to do with people that have been part of the movement for a long time and have seen, its ebb and flow. Give us an idea from what you're seeing currently within Messianic Judaism of its overall health spiritually. Like are we fulfilling the purpose that God has asked us to do?
Only God could decide that. But and I'm close with him, but he hasn't. He
Not
hasn't
that
said.
close.
He's talked
He
to me.
talks
About,
to you,
he talks
right?
to me about other things.
Yeah.
In my understanding, from what I shared earlier, I think we need to get back to that original vision. Ultimately, right now where we are, I see our ministry, our union, as bifurcated. One side are the congregations that are more church-like. And I'm not, with no value given, good or bad, they are simply more church-like. They gravitate in that direction. They function that way. Not just in polity, but in their worship, in their self-understanding. You have other congregations that function more like synagogues. Their worship service is more like a synagogue. Possibly their order, their leadership, however, function that way. I think over time, the ones that are more traditional, Jewish traditional, will have more of a solid Jewish identity, and they'll be seen as synagogues. The ones that lean more towards the church may assimilate into the churches. I don't know for sure, but
If not already happening de facto.
They'll be more formally connected with churches. They identify themselves theologically and align themselves with those churches. And I think if that's the case, you'll see a split, not necessarily a bad split, but just a difference of style. But it'll make a difference. Just like if you're a conservative Jew, you can go to any conservative synagogue, your service is basically the same. If you go to a Reform service and you're conservative, it's going to be different. If you're Orthodox, you pretty much have to go to an Orthodox service for what you want. So with a bifurcated movement, to me, means if I want a traditional Messianic service that's more traditionally oriented, I'm going to have to go to those congregations which are more traditional. And if I want more of a charismatic or Baptistic type service, and I don't want to go to a Baptist church or something, I'll go to one of those congregations. But I don't see them coming together. I see them drifting apart. And we may have one heart together, but very different ways of worshiping. One features dancing all the time, and the other one will feature more traditional liturgy.
Yeah.
And without putting a value on it, it's just the way it is. But I think, it may be that God raised up both, because there's more than one kind of Jewish person. So just like there are some people who only would like to worship in an Orthodox synagogue, And there are some people who love Reform Judaism, and the conservatives are halfway in between. But they each meet a need for different people. So the
It
same
doesn't
is
have to be one size fits all.
right, and the
Yeah.
same is true for the Messianic movement. There are some congregations that may wind up catering to a more churchy type of Messianic Judaism, and that may be good for some people. That's what they need. And the others, will find their personal needs met better in a traditional service. It's not a value judgment. It's simply an acknowledgement of where people are.
I think my only concern with that is the part of our purpose, which is to be a place for intermarried families to pass on Jewish values and identity and calling to the next generation.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if both of those worship structures support that in the same way. And then the second part is, I think the Messianic congregations that feel more church-like also probably attract more Gentiles, more non-Jewish people who are interested, like you said, in maybe like worshiping on the correct day or being more holy than the church down the street. And that too can become where you live in a community that is in reality mostly not Jewish. I think it's very difficult to have clarity of identity and to pass on those values.
Being the fact that I lean towards the more traditional side, I totally agree with that assessment. And
I think it's been our experience at Beth Yeshua.
But
too,
that's
and maybe
been-
that's really kind of what's at the core.
but recognize
of
that
things.
is part of the problem.
Right.
And
Yeah.
again, I'm not trying to put a value judgment on it,
Right.
but both types of Messianic Judaism can be inclusive of the non-Jewish spouse.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That's
Should
not
be.
a question
Right.
of that.
Right.
But if someone's looking for what's genuinely Jewish, like if you want to bring your family and say, look, we're part of a Jewish thing. It's not, going to church. I would want them to go to the traditional one because that is more consistent with normative Jewish practice.
Yeah. I was thinking, I don't remember which rabbi it was who, I think it was down in LA, had like a Saturday meeting and a Sunday meeting. And like Saturday meeting, was it, I don't know if
I'm
it
trying to
was.
think who that was.
It wasn't Sobel, was it? Was it
I'm
Rabbi
not-
Sobel?
I'm not sure.
I can't remember, but there was somebody that tried to let's actually split it. Let's actually have a more traditional Jewish service on Saturdays for Jewish and intermarried families, and let's have a more kind of Jewish church sort of a
Roots kind of
feeling.
thing.
In other words, one was a Jewish service, the other one was Jewish.
Correct. And
Right.
what they found was the Jewish families, especially with young children, wanted the more churchy sort of a service rather than the traditional one. I don't know what was the main differences. I don't know if they offered child care at one and not the I don't know.
Yeah.
But
Well,
I would
we
be
don't even know what
curious
the
about
experience,
that.
what they'd come from. Did they come from
Right.
church?
Yeah.
The other
and were they
thing was-
intermarried, which is another strong
There could be another factor too, and that is the fact that if they go to the Sunday one, they've got Saturday free.
Right.
Yep.
Years ago, I led a congregation that had Friday night services and Sunday morning services. And early on in the movement, that's what we had. The Friday night was our main worship service. The Sunday morning one, for lack of a better reason, was to block people from going to church. So they come to us instead. And eventually, we got over that. And more congregations moved to a Saturday service, just one Saturday service.
Yeah, I've been thinking about, we began at some point and then COVID hit, having Jewish and intermarried families come to our home for a Havdalah on Saturday afternoons from 4 to 7, and having a meal together and then just singing the blessings at the end of Shabbat together. And it was really sweet, that one that we were able to pull off. And I've been thinking about maybe other non-traditional ways, or at least maybe according to our traditions,
Yeah.
of like really trying to engage those. It was fun, you know, like families could take their kids to the park and all the kids could run, and then the moms and dads could talk, and then everybody came back and had dessert together, and then we, you know, and then we passed around the spice box, and we and the candle, and you know, I mean, it was just, yeah, there was something very Hamish about it. You know, I mean, there's more than one way for us to go about doing this, and I wonder about that sometimes within our community, of what would help serve those intermarried families, and reach them where they're at, and make room for them in the living room.
You know, I'll tell you a story. I used to lead a congregation in Ohio, and say more than 50% of the people were Jewish. I had a woman come to me she was a Jewish believer from a Baptist church, and she asked me if we would bar mitzvah her son, and I said no. Because I said, you go to a Baptist church, why, you don't come here, why do you want us to bar mitzvah your son? And her reason was, it'll be a witness. I said, you don't come here, how would it possibly be a witness? She wanted to showcase for her family to say, look, I'm doing something Jewish, but it wasn't a real part of her life. It was it was a lie. And I would not have any part of that. I said, no. I said, what I will do is that if you will commit to come twice a month, every other week, with your son, we'll put him through bar mitzvah lessons, and he can have a bar mitzvah. But you've got to be here. It's got to be really part of your life. And she was not willing to do that, because she felt being deceptive was in some way being a testimony. If you're being deceptive, it is never a testimony.
True,
and you can't, you know, it's, who are you kidding? You know, I didn't want to be part of it. It made it feel unclean. If the only thing that's a good testimony is being real.
Right.
And if the kid would have come every week or every other week, if the mother would come, the family, then yeah, I would have accommodated them, because it would have been real. But
That reminds me of when you were doing, you don't do weddings, you do marriages.
Right.
So people coming just from outside, for maybe one or more of them is Jewish, wanting him to marry them under the chuppah, but they weren't attending with us. They weren't part of the congregation.
Right.
And that felt false.
Right,
Yeah.
100%.
And you turned
Yeah.
some of them away.
I did. Yeah.
yeah, but it was when I asked her why, and she said, well, it'll be a testimony. What does a testimony mean? What are you testifying to? That I can be fake? That's no testimony.
No.
And that's not who I am. It has to be real.
Because she wanted the rest of her Jewish family to see that she was still involved in Jewish life and
Something
identity,
life cycle.
and that it meant something to her,
Yeah.
when really it didn't.
And it
Did
obviously
she be with you?
It obviously meant so little that she was unwilling to do even that. In other words, I should put my effort in for the witness she wanted to be, but she was unwilling.
Right.
And, you know, I'm not here for fake stuff.
No.
Yeah. Same.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a great place for us to wrap up. Thank you,
Okay.
Rabbi.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, this is
Yeah.
pretty awesome. It's given us a lot of food for thought, I'm sure. So we'll spend like 2 or 3 episodes just debriefing and digesting
Yeah.
and talking through
And
this.
refuting everything I said.
Not at
No,
all. Not at
no.
all. We really
Yeah.
honor.
Our desire is
yeah.
actually to really hear. I feel like there's a lot of people who aren't listening in this world, just in general. And I actually really liked, and I'm sure he stole it maybe from some other rabbi, but Rabbi Dowerman used to say, you should be very convinced that what you're doing is right, but you should always leave a little window open, just in case you might be wrong, you know, and that's where we want to be, for sure. So thank you. I guess I should talk to the camera again. Hi, everyone. If you like this, come back. We're going to do more of it, and go to YouTube and Beth Yeshua Sacramento if you want to see us, not just hear us. And if you want to check out our community, it's bethyeshua.org. Thank you so much. All right.
Thank you for having
Bye,
me.
everyone. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can always visit bethyeshua.org for more.